Today's webinar is on Southwest Minnesota Arts Council Equipment and Facilities Improvement Grants. Welcome everyone. I'm Carolyn Koska, the Financial and Grants Administrator at Southwest Minnesota Arts Council. Today we're going to talk just briefly about Southwest Minnesota Arts Council, or SMOC, which is our acronym. We'll go through the program guidelines for this grant, take a look at the application, and some general tips and process for our grants. For the moment, you are muted. If you'd like to ask some questions, just type them in the chat window throughout the presentation, and I'll try and watch for those and answer your questions. Also, at the end of the presentation, I will unmute everyone, and you'll be able to talk in person then if you have some more questions. So we'll get started. The Southwest Minnesota Arts Council is a nonprofit organization committed to promoting and encouraging the development of the arts in the 18 counties of Southwest Minnesota by serving as a source of funds and technical services, which enable local organizations, educational institutions, and individuals to sponsor and/or create and promote the arts in their communities. SMOC is one of 11 regional arts councils in the state of Minnesota. Here's our region that we cover right here. We receive money from the state, both from their general fund and the arts and cultural heritage funds through the legacy amendment. And along with the rest of the state that supports arts activities, we are committed to supporting artists and arts organizations in creating, producing, and presenting high-quality arts activities, overcoming barriers to accessing high-quality arts activities, instilling the arts into the community and public life, supporting high-quality, age-appropriate arts education for all ages to develop knowledge, skills, and understanding of the arts, supporting events and activities that represent the diverse ethnic and cultural arts traditions of the region, including folk and traditional artists and arts organizations. So those are things to keep in mind as you're thinking about your grant projects. They should address some of those issues. This particular grant program is Equipment and Facilities Improvement, which is open to arts organizations in the 18 counties of the SMOC region for the purchase of equipment items and facilities improvements that will strengthen the arts organization's capacity to serve the arts needs of the region. In this case, we're defining arts organizations as organizations whose mission is focused primarily on the arts. We do accept requests for equipment from non-arts organizations if they can make the case that their main purpose is to support community arts projects, but that has to be a very strong case for those non-arts organizations. Some types of projects that we've funded under this program before include sound and lighting equipment, theater curtains and rigging, trapdoors, dance floors, risers, all kinds of structural improvements that might be bathrooms, elevators, windows or doors, making your space more accessible, signage. We've also done projects for storage. If you need shelving, we've done projects for storage trailers. Computers, tablets, printers, software, office furniture is also eligible. Instruments, kilns and other studio equipment for arts classes, and even things as basic as chairs and tables for the activities that you're planning to do. If your organization does not own the space it uses, you'll need a signed facility cooperative agreement between your organization and the facility owner. It should outline how your organization will be able to have access to your equipment and the improvements that you're doing. Later when we look at the application, I can show you there's a sample agreement for you to look at. Equipment and facilities improvement grants are available up to $10,000. So you can request up to that $10,000 or 80% of your project's cash costs, whichever is less. So if your project costs well over $10,000, you'll be receiving less than 80% of that with that $10,000 cap. Applicants must provide at least a 20% cash match toward their project. You might score better when your grant is reviewed if you have more than 20% toward the project. Applicants that have received an operating support grant cannot include prorated general operating costs in the budget for other grants, such as this one, that take place during the same time period as their operating support grant. And with this program, applicants may only receive up to $50,000 for equipment and facilities improvement within a 10-year time frame. Here are some eligibility items to note. These are following here are not eligible for SMOC grants. New construction or purchase of real estate, activities of a for-profit project organization or business. And then these next ones with the equipment and facilities requests, you kind of have to think about what you're going to be eventually doing with the equipment or your space. So projects that don't have an art focus, educational projects within a school system, activities that take place outside of Minnesota, activities not open to the public, activities for the religious socialization of the participants or audience, fundraising events. In other words, your grant funding should allow projects to break even, not make a profit. Payments of debts incurred before the grant begins, grant funds being used to match another SMOC grant, or applicants who have past due final reports from other grants. So all of those are not eligible for our grants. And just a note to make sure to check the full program guidelines and general grant guidelines for all of the eligibility information. Your project will need to have a start date and end date. The start date is the point at which your project is set in motion, which could include whenever you start ordering and paying for supplies, payment of fees or contracts, any kind of advertising. So you can't spend any money before that project start date. If for some reason there is something that you absolutely have to purchase before that start date, like a deposit on a contract that you can't do any later, you cannot include that expense in your grant project budget. And your start date should not be the date of your first activity or event. You'll want to allow yourself some time before that to prepare anything. You'll also need to choose your project end date, which should allow time after your activities are finished to wrap up your project. So for this program, we have 2 rounds. The first round deadline, which is coming up, is August 15th. And then the earliest allowable project start date for that is October 15th. So you could not start anything toward your project, excuse me, until October 15th. And then round 2 is in February. One thing to note, all applications must be submitted by 4:30 p.m. on the deadline date. The system will not allow you to submit after that time. Your project will need to have both a project director and an authorizing official. The project director will be the person who's most directly responsible for the project, and it may or may not be the grant writer. Oftentimes it is. And then you'll need an authorizing official, which would be your organization's president, treasurer, or someone else who has authorizing power for your organization. And these two cannot be the same person. And both will need to sign the application, contract, and final report. If your organization does not have 501c3 status, you will need to find an organization that does have that to act as your fiscal sponsor. You'll need to have a signed agreement spelling out the relationship between your organization and the fiscal sponsor that needs to be submitted with the application. And a representative of the fiscal sponsor needs to sign, again, the application, contract, and final report. The fiscal sponsor will receive the grant funds and they are legally responsible for the project. So that's why they need to sign everything as well. Any questions at this point? I'll just wait a couple moments here if anyone needs to type any questions into that chat window. I'm not seeing any questions at the moment, but feel free to type them in as we continue, and we will move on. Oops, and take a look at where to find things on our website and how to get into our online grant system. So there's several places on our website to get into information about grants. You can log into our grant system right from the homepage here. Otherwise, all our grants are listed here. Here's our equipment and facilities improvement grants. Here's a button right here. You can log into the online grant system from there. On each of our grant program pages, you'll find links to guidelines for that specific program, general grant guidelines that apply to all programs, so it's important to look at both of those. A list of the questions that you'll find on the application, and this is in a Word document format, so that if you'd like to work in that first, answer your questions in there and then later paste them into the application, you can do that. Here's the budget form that you'll need to fill out, a list of the criteria that the reviewers will use to evaluate your application, and a video tutorial for the online grant system. Also, it lists our deadlines for the year. So if you are ready to go into the online grant system, you would click here. If you don't already have an account, you can create a new account here. Again, here's a link to that video tutorial that walks you through that whole process. Or if you already have an account, you can sign in. When you log in, you'll see your applicant dashboard, or if you're logging in for the first time, you'll be taken directly to this apply screen. You can click here on top to go there, and also at the bottom. So when you click apply, you'll see a list of all of our available grant programs. You'll want to scroll through and find the one you need. If you want to just look at it before starting an application, you can click this preview button. Otherwise, if you're ready to move forward, you can click on apply, which will start an application for you. So here's the application. You'll need to have a name for your project. Put in the amount that you're requesting, which you may want to fill out your budget form first to confirm that amount. Here are some of those links to those documents that are also available on our website. And then just getting started in the application, you'll need to describe your project. Here's a place this is optional, if you have any photos that you want to include of the space that you're wanting to renovate, or any technical diagrams of how you're planning your lighting system is going to work, you can upload those there. Here's the project start date and end date that we talked about. You'll need to talk about your planning, who's all involved. if you're contracting someone to do some of the work for you, why did you choose them? And then here's that facility cooperative agreement that we talked about, and there's the sample agreement there. Then you come to the budget form. There are a couple of samples of the form here that'll help you figure out how to fill it out. One for if you're estimating that you're going to request that your project expenses are more than the maximum request amount of $10,000, and one if they're less. So we'll just take a look at one of these, maybe. Oh, here we go. So it has instructions for the entire form to how to fill out your expenses, how to calculate out what you need for your cash match, and then finally what that final request amount is going to be. So this is a good place to start before you start doing your budget. When you're ready to actually do your budget, if you click here, this will open up a blank budget form, which you'll save to your computer, fill it out, and then upload it here. If you have equipment purchases or labor greater than $500, so if each equipment item, if one of those is greater than $500, you'll need to have a minimum of 2 bids from 2 separate vendors or contractors for that equipment or labor. And here's a couple upload fields. You may need to combine those into a couple documents or files in order to fit in these 2 fields, but you are required to have those 2 bids for each of those purchases. You'll need to provide some history about your organization, what kind of programs you do, how you would describe the artistic quality of the programming, the kind of support you have from your community, information about your board members, and then how your organization addresses accessibility. You'll list any previous grants you've received from other funders. We provide to the reviewers a list of grants that you've received from us. So this would just be other funders. You'll need to provide some financial information from your most recently completed year, a beginning balance, your total income, your total expenses, and your ending balance. And then there's also a place to explain any of that. For instance, if you had a loss, how that was covered. You'll talk about what kind of impact this project is having on your organization. How does it relate to your mission? What is it going to enable you to do? And then just some numbers about people participating. You'll need to have an outcome evaluation plan, which includes goals, and then what you plan will be your method to figure out whether you've achieved those goals or not. This is a little trickier for these equipment and facilities improvement projects. Some people like to think, well, our project is to buy a new printer. Our goal is to buy a printer. We'll know that we achieved our goal when we have a printer. You need to think a little beyond that and say, what is this printer going to enable us to do? And in that case, you may want to extend your end date out a little bit so you have some time to use the equipment and get some feedback and know whether those goals are being met. If you end up doing any sort of survey about your improvements, for instance, checking with your audience to see what difference they have noticed with your new sound system, you can upload that tool here, but that is not required. This next section is just some data about your organization that's collected for the Minnesota State Arts Board. It has no bearing on the actual scoring of your application, just data that we need to collect. If you click on these links, that'll give you your options for the codes to choose from to fill those out. Next is a bunch of contact information, the legal name of your organization, and if you have another name by which you're known, if we should use that for publicity. And then here's where you put information about your project director, your authorizing official, and then if you are using a fiscal sponsor for this project and click yes, it'll show up the information for the fiscal sponsor as well. You'll need to upload your 501c3 status letter, or if you're using a fiscal sponsor, you would upload theirs here. And then finally, just your electronic signatures. So as you're working, you'll need to scroll down to the bottom and click this Save button. When you're all done, you can click Submit. For now, we're just going to save. As a note, when you're saving or trying to submit, it'll give you a list of here are the remaining questions that you need to answer. So it will not let you submit if you are missing one of the required questions. So this takes, let's go back to our dashboard here. So now you see you've got one grant draft listed under your active requests. If you'd like to get back in to keep editing, you can click here. Later, if you've received a grant, this is also where your contract and final report will be available. Any questions right now? I don't see any questions yet, but again, feel free to type those in at any time, and we're gonna head back and just a few tips to think about as you're working on your application. It's a really good thing to start early so that you have time to gather up everything that you'll need and to get any questions answered if you need to contact us about anything. It's really important to read those guidelines carefully, both the program guidelines and our general grant guidelines. You'll need to read all of the questions fully. A lot of them have a few different parts to them, so make sure you're covering all of that. It's a great thing to keep your answers clear and concise. Our reviewers are reading a lot of grants, so there's no need to go on and on. It's also a good idea to assume that the grant reviewers don't know anything about your organization or your project. Basically, if it's not in the application, they can't take it into account, even if they're personally familiar with your organization or gone to some of your productions in the past. It has to be in that grant to be considered. And then finally, it's important to have someone proofread your application. I see I've got a question in now. They're talking about purchasing a new computer and asking about bids. Do they need to be from a local source? Or if you went to Best Buy, how would you get the bid? They don't necessarily have to be local. An easy way is to go to the Best Buy website and find something similar that you're looking for and just print out a page of the listing of that computer. So we as Southwest Minnesota Arts Council staff are here to help you with your application. We don't have any say in what gets funded or not. We're just here as your advocate. So it's a good idea to call us to talk about your project before starting an application. Make sure you're applying in the right program, that your project is eligible, get any questions answered. Also, as you're filling out your application, if you run into any questions, you can contact us. We can review your application before you submit it up to 2 weeks before the deadline. After that point, it's possible we can also still review it, but we can't guarantee that. But we can just look through it ahead of time, make sure everything is covered. A little bit about the grant review process. So after you submit your application, SMOC staff reviews it for eligibility and completeness. Then all of your applications will go to a panel of qualified individuals from the SMOC region, and they'll discuss and score the applications based on the criteria for the program, which we'll talk about in a minute. And then finally, those recommendations go to our board of directors that will approve the final funding of those grants. So the criteria for scoring for equipment and facilities grants, first of all, the merit of the organization and the artistic quality of its programs. So you want to make sure you fully describe what you do and make sure that you have a solid description of your artistic quality. That's worth the most at 18 points. Then we'll also be looking at the impact of the project on your organization. What is this project going to do for you? Worth 11 points. Then the feasibility of the project, which will include any planning, timelines, budget. Did you choose the appropriate people and equipment to do this project? And then finally, your outcome evaluation plan, which is just worth 2 points. If your grant is awarded, you'll need to complete an online contract within 30 days. After completing that contract, you'll receive 80% of your grant award before your start date. And then you'll receive the remaining 20% of your grant award after your project and final report are completed. SMOC's financial assistance must be acknowledged on all publicity and promotional materials using the credit line included in the grant contract. And depending on the source of the funds for your grant, you may also need to include the Minnesota Legacy logo. And the posters and logos will be sent to you and are also available on our website. For equipment purchases, sometimes groups will just put a little label on the equipment itself saying where it came from. You must complete an online final report within 60 days of your project end date. It's a good idea to look through your final report when you actually start your project. We assign that to you when you are awarded the grant. So you'll know what information you'll need to be gathering, any attendance, costs, outcomes related to your goals. So that's a good idea to look at that. I see another question here. This organization has submitted grants in the past. If this person signs up as a new user, will they have access to previous grants to copy and paste basic information? Each application is tied to the account that initially created it. Other users for that organization can look at information, but they can't edit it if they were not the one that did that. But you are able to see what your organization has been doing before. If you need to contact us, we are in the office from 8 to 4:30 with the lunch break. Here's our phone number and email if you have any questions for us. Thank you for joining us today for this webinar, and let us know if you have any further questions.